My name is Emily Carter, U.S. Navy SEAL, and on the day I got married, there were 142 people in attendance. Still, not one of them belonged to my family. When the church doors swung open, sunlight poured down the aisle like a spotlight on a stage. The organ started its slow, steady melody, and every head turned. Cameras lifted, whispers spread, smiles formed. Everyone looked, except toward the first 3 pews I had reserved for my parents and my brother. They remained empty. White ribbons lined the seats, untouched, as if they had been placed there for ghosts. I walked forward on my own. No father's arm to lean on, no guiding presence, just the sound of my heels against marble and the controlled rhythm of my breathing. Years of command had trained me to stay composed under pressure. Even so, when my eyes flickered toward those vacant seats, something inside me slipped for a second. I forced my focus ahead, locking on to David, the man waiting at the altar. He smiled at me, steady and grounded. He had a calmness that came from building engines, from understanding how things worked and how to fix them when they broke. He had never worn a uniform, never served in the military, but he understood discipline, trust, and quiet strength. That was enough for me. When I reached him, he took my hand, and for a brief moment, the emptiness behind me disappeared. The ceremony unfolded with precision. The chaplain, an old Navy friend, spoke gently about loyalty and endurance. His words carried deeper meaning for me: loyalty in battle, endurance in family. When it was time for vows, my voice stayed firm. I had already given everything to my country. Promising David felt simple compared to that. After the applause faded and the congratulations began, the evening dissolved into laughter, music, and champagne. David's family filled the dance floor. His mother embraced me and whispered, "You have us now." It was meant to comfort me, but it struck somewhere deeper than she intended. I kept glancing toward the entrance, half expecting my father to arrive late with some excuse. He never did. Neither did my mother or my brother. The last message I had received from him months ago was short and cold. "Don't expect much from us." Later that night, after the guests had gone, David and I sat on the hotel balcony overlooking the harbor. Ships glowed faintly in the distance, their engines humming softly in the dark. I sipped my champagne, but it tasted bitter, almost like salt. My phone lay on the table, silent, its screen dark, still waiting for something that would never come. "You don't have to keep waiting," David said quietly. I know, even though part of me didn't. In the Navy, you prepare for the worst, but still hope for the best. I had hoped they might change their minds. He placed his hand over mine. Family isn't about who's supposed to show up, it's about who actually does. I smiled at him, but when he looked away, my eyes filled. I didn't let the tears fall. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the curtains. I sat by the window wearing the silk robe the hotel had provided, staring out at the harbor again. It looked peaceful, almost enough to convince me the pain wasn't real. Then I noticed the invitation lying on the table. It was addressed to Mr. and Mrs. Thomas Carter and family, untouched. I picked it up, ran my fingers across the embossed letters, then folded it carefully and slipped it into my uniform jacket. Some reminders are meant to hurt. They keep you grounded. We spent the following week traveling along the coast, stopping at quiet diners and old shipyards. David loved small towns. I loved watching how easily he spoke to strangers, as if everyone mattered. For a while, I managed to forget about my family. But when we returned home to Norfolk, the silence came back. I hadn't realized how heavy silence could be until it became the only thing my family gave me. Days turned into routine. I buried myself in work, training recruits, reviewing reports, mentoring younger officers who reminded me of who I used to be. Discipline was easier than dealing with grief. At night, after David fell asleep, I would scroll through old photos, my brother's graduation, my parents' anniversary, holidays before my first deployment. In every picture, I was smiling too hard, trying too much. I started to wonder if that was when it began, when my success became something they resented. Growing up, I never disobeyed my father. He was a school principal, strict and respected. When I enlisted, he told me the military was no place for a girl. When I came back, decorated, he warned me not to get arrogant. When I was promoted, he said nothing at all. So maybe I should have expected those empty seats. Maybe silence was always his way of teaching me a lesson. One night, I tried calling him anyway. The phone rang twice before going to voicemail. I left a short message. "Hi, Dad. Just wanted you to know the wedding went well. I'm okay." Then I hung up before my voice could break. A few days later, I received a card from one of my Navy teammates who had attended. It said, "You stood taller walking alone than most people do with an army behind them." That line stayed with me. Not because it made me proud, but because it confirmed something I hadn't wanted to admit. I had been alone. David read the card later and looked at me. "You really walked that aisle by yourself, didn't you?" "Yeah," I said. "Looks like I always will." He shook his head. "No, not anymore. You've got me. You've got a home." For the first time, I believed him. I thought the silence from my family might fade over time. I thought it would stop hurting. I was wrong. Weeks later, the silence finally broke. A single message from my father appeared on my phone. It was so unexpected, so absurd, I had to read it twice. "Need $8,400 for your brother's wedding. You've always been the responsible one." I stared at the screen in disbelief. After everything, after months of silence, that was what he reached out for? Money. David leaned over my shoulder. "You're joking." "I wish I was," I said. I laughed, but there was no humor in it, just disbelief spilling out. David asked quietly, "What are you going to do?" I didn't answer right away. I just stared at the phone. Then I opened my banking app and transferred exactly $1. In the note, I wrote, "Best wishes." After that, I blocked his number, looked at David, and said, "Change the locks tomorrow." He nodded without hesitation, because in our house, silence didn't mean fear anymore. It meant peace. The morning after sending that $1 transfer, I expected something to happen. A call, a confrontation, something loud, but nothing came. The sky above Norfolk stayed gray and still. David left for work like any other day, coffee in hand, pressing a kiss to my forehead. I sat by the window with my laptop open, pretending to focus on a report, but my attention kept drifting to my phone. The blocked number sat there, quiet, almost mocking. My father had raised me to be disciplined, but he had forgotten that discipline works both ways. By midday, I unblocked him, not because I wanted to speak, but because the silence had started to feel heavier than any argument. 2 minutes later, a message came through. "That's funny. Didn't think you'd be so petty. Your brother's wedding is next month. Don't embarrass us again." I read it slowly. The word petty stayed with me. Not because it insulted me, but because of how casually it was said, as if everything between us had been reduced to something trivial. I started typing replies, deleting each one. None of them felt right. Then I remembered something from training. Silence is the loudest response to disrespect. So I turned off my phone. That evening, David came home and found me polishing my medals, something I hadn't done in a long time. "You okay?" he asked. "Just keeping things in order," I said. "You don't have to prove anything to him," he replied. "I'm not. I'm proving it to myself." The following weeks felt lighter in a strange way. I focused on work, recruiting recruits, running early morning drills. Watching the new batch reminded me of my younger self, hopeful, unaware of how much family could shape you. One afternoon, Chief Ramos stopped me in the hallway. "Ma'am, I saw your father last week." I froze. "What?" "He was asking about you, trying to find out where you were stationed." A slow breath left my lungs. "You didn't tell him anything?" "No, ma'am." "Good." I walked away, but something inside me tightened. My father hadn't just crossed a boundary, he was trying to reclaim control. That night, sleep didn't come easily. I stood in the kitchen staring at the dim light of the fridge while rain tapped against the windows. David joined me quietly. "You're thinking about him again," he said. "I'm trying not to," I admitted, "but it feels like I've been trained to wait for him." He leaned against the counter. "Then untrain yourself. You're not his soldier anymore." I gave a faint smile. "No, I'm not." A week later, a handwritten letter arrived, my father's handwriting, sharp and familiar. It accused me of forgetting where I came from, of thinking I was better than them. It ended with a cold line: "You'll die alone with your medals." I folded the letter and placed it in a drawer. No ceremony, no reaction, just distance. That was when I decided. I wouldn't fight him the way he expected. I wouldn't argue, wouldn't explain, wouldn't defend myself. I would simply step back and let the silence stand. There it was, another attack. But instead of anger, I felt an unexpected calm. This was his last trick, trying to stain what he couldn't control. That night, I went for a long run along the harbor. The air was sharp, the water reflecting city lights like scattered stars. Every step felt like shedding a layer of expectation, guilt, shame. When I got home, I opened my notebook and wrote a single line across the page. Family doesn't mean obedience. It means respect. 2 weeks later, I received a message from an unknown number. "You've turned everyone against me. I hope you're happy." No signature, but I didn't need one. For a long time, I just stared at the words. Then I deleted the message and blocked the number again. After that, I poured myself a cup of tea, went to the porch, and watched the quiet street outside. Somewhere far off, a train horn echoed deep, mournful, fading into distance. I whispered to myself, "Let it go." And for once, I meant it. The next morning, something small but powerful shifted inside me. I woke before my alarm, made breakfast, and packed David's lunch before he even came downstairs. He looked surprised. "You okay?" "I think so," I said. For the first time in a while, he smiled. "So what changed?" "I stopped fighting ghosts," I said simply. "They can't hear you anyway." That Sunday, I went back to church for the first time since the wedding. I sat in the back pew and listened, not for forgiveness, not for guidance, just for silence. And in that silence, I found something that felt almost like peace. I didn't need their validation. I didn't need their apology. I only needed to believe I was enough as I was, and for the first time, I did. Summer came to Norfolk, heavy with heat and forgiveness I wasn't ready to give. The air smelled of cut grass and tar warming on the roads. David and I settled into small routines, Saturdays at the farmer's market, weeknights walking past the harbor until the sky went lavender. I wore my hair down more, laughed easier, learned the names of the older couple next door who waved from their porch swing at dusk. Peace had a shape now. It looked like ordinary life. Then the pastor from my hometown called. I recognized his number before I answered. I hadn't spoken to him since before the wedding, since the premarital counseling he'd offered over coffee and scripture and common sense. Back then, he'd asked kindly if I thought my father would attend. I'd said yes. I'd believed it like sunrise. "Commander Carter," he said, slipping my rank between nostalgia and respect. "Do you have a minute?" "I do," I said, steadying my voice against whatever news he carried. "I hate to be the one to tell you," he said, "but your brother's wedding has been postponed, possibly canceled." I sank into a kitchen chair and stared at the refrigerator, at a postcard of the Atlantic, pressed under a magnet shaped like an anchor. "Why?" Well, he paused, choosing the gentlest path. "There's debt, more than the fiancé knew, some past due accounts, a car he said he owned outright but he doesn't, and another person who believes she's engaged to him too." I let out a breath that felt like a confession. That sounds like him. "I'm not calling to gossip," the pastor added. "Your father's business is also in trouble. Tax liens, a contractor who wasn't paid. He's proud, Emily, too proud to ask for help. He says he's the injured party, but I think he's drowning. The words should have felt like vindication, or maybe karma wearing church shoes. Instead, they thudded in my chest like stones. "What do you want me to do?" I asked. "Nothing you can't live with," he said. "Sometimes all a storm needs is a dry place to pass over." He paused, then added softly, "Would you consider praying for him? Not so he changes, so you do." After we hung up, I stared out the window at the road shimmering in the heat. Somewhere, a lawnmower droned. A child laughed 2 houses down. I wasn't a saint. I wasn't even a regular at church, but I folded my hands on the table and whispered a clumsy prayer anyway, half plea, half surrender. "God, I don't want him hurt," I said into the quiet. "I just want him to stop hurting me." That evening, I told David. He set 2 plates on the table and listened without interrupting, the way he does when a machine is speaking in clicks no one else can hear. "So," he said gently, "do you feel like driving down there, seeing him?" I shook my head. "If I go now, I'll be the bailout, and I won't be that again." "You're allowed to protect yourself," he said. "Protection isn't revenge, it's stewardship." I smiled at the word. It made my heart sound like something I could manage. Balance sheets and maintenance schedules, not open wounds. A week later, another letter arrived, this one in my mother's slanted hand. She wrote that my brother's fiancé had moved out of their apartment. She wrote that vendors were calling the house. She wrote that the bank had some concerns. Between the lines, she wrote that she was scared. I read it on the back steps while the evening cooled and the azaleas along the fence shook with a breeze. I could see my mother's face as clearly as if she were across from me, the neat lipstick, the quiet eyes that always looked down before they looked up. She was expert at pretending a crisis was merely a complicated errand. I loved her, and I resented her for making me hold the whole world steady. I didn't answer, not because I wanted her to suffer, but because every reply from me had become a confession. I'll fix it. I had to unlearn that habit like a bad trigger squeeze. Days stretched. Norfolk summer's storms rolled through at regular intervals. Fat drops, fast thunder, steam curling off the street afterward. I ran in the rain one afternoon and thought about a day 20 years earlier, the first summer my father let me help fix the fence behind our house. He'd handed me a post-hole digger as if it were a ceremonial sword. "Keep the line straight," he'd said, pointing down a string he'd staked between 2 corners. The air had been full of honeysuckle and wet dirt. I remember his big hands steadying the cedar post as we packed soil back around it. He'd shown me how to sight the level, how to read the bubble, how to correct for a slight lean. When we'd finished, he'd wiped his forehead with the back of his wrist and surveyed our work like a king. Then he'd looked at me, not through me, not around me, and said, "Good, that'll hold." I sat on the curb outside our house in Norfolk, slick with rain and memory, and I cried for the girl who believed that sentence meant I would hold. For years I had. I'd been the level, the line, the steady weight against the lean. But fences can't hold everything, neither can daughters. The pastor called again 2 weeks later. "Your father asked me to tell you he wants to talk. He said he won't say he's sorry. He asked me not to say that on his behalf, but he did ask me to tell you he's tired." Tired? The man I knew was powered by pride and caffeine and the conviction that other people's feelings were overdramatic. The word didn't fit his shape. It startled me. "Thank you," I told the pastor, "for being the bridge without pushing me across." He chuckled softly. "Bridges just stand. People decide if they walk." Some nights, I felt the tug to drive down to stand across from my father in the kitchen where I'd done homework while he graded papers. I could have told him about the recruits I was mentoring, about the girl from Kansas who'd broken her mile time, about the boy from Maine who wrote home every Sunday and called his grandmother before lights out. I could have handed him a stack of evidence that I'd built a life both gentle and strong. I could have asked him to be proud just once. Instead, I wrote a single postcard, the lighthouse at Cape Henry, a slash of white against blue. On the back, I wrote, "Thinking of you." I didn't sign it, didn't add my return address. I addressed it to my mother. I knew she would show him, and I knew he wouldn't know what to do with a message that didn't give instructions. A month later, I got the news the way you get most news now, third hand on a weekday between tasks. My cousin messaged that my brother's wedding was officially canceled. "He's in a bad place," she wrote. "Don't kick him while he's down." I stared at the screen, feeling no triumph, no relief. Only a tired ache for a boy who had grown up learning that somebody else would pay. We'd both inherited a ledger. His ink ran to debts, mine to obligations. Maybe we were the same lesson written in two languages. That evening, David found me folding laundry with the kind of furious care reserved for grief. He took a shirt from my hands and said, "Let it wrinkle." I laughed, and the sound surprised me. Then I said, "Do you think I'm hard-hearted?" He shook his head. "I think you're learning to put your heart where people can't trample it." We sat on the floor with clean towels piled around us like small, soft barricades. The house was quiet. Even the clock seemed to breathe slower. Before bed, I stepped out onto the porch. The sky over Norfolk was clear, stars sharp. Somewhere in the distance, a ship's horn sounded long, low, certain. I closed my eyes and pictured that old fence again, the level bubble finding center, the cedar post settling into the earth. "Hold," I whispered to myself, "you'll hold." And for the first time, holding didn't mean bearing someone else's weight. It meant standing where I'd planted myself and letting the storm pass, not as punishment, but as weather. When I finally went inside, David was already asleep, one arm flung over my side of the bed like a promise. I lay down gently and listened to his breathing until mine matched it. Somewhere between waking and sleep, I said a quiet prayer that didn't ask for victory or apology, only for the kind of mercy that looks like wisdom. If there's an education older Americans understand, it's that some lessons arrive slow and stay forever. Mine had boundaries, our love wearing boots. Forgiveness is not letting anger choose your route. And honor, real honor, doesn't always salute. Sometimes it simply refuses to go back. It was late September when the phone rang. I almost didn't answer. It was a Virginia area code I didn't recognize. I was halfway through polishing a report for command review, half listening to the hum of the ceiling fan. The voice on the other end was quiet but firm. "Commander Carter, this is Pastor Lewis." My heart slowed. The air in the room thickened. "Yes, Pastor," I said carefully. "It's been a while." He hesitated, then said, "Your father's in the hospital. Heart failure. He's stable for now, but it's serious." For a moment, I said nothing. I'd imagined this call before, on bad nights, when anger blurred with pity, when I pictured him old and regretful. But imagining something and hearing it were two different wars. "What hospital?" I asked. "St. Mary's in Richmond." "I'll come," I said automatically. When we hung up, I sat still for a long time. David found me like that, hands on my knees, staring at nothing. "Who was it?" "The pastor," I said. "Dad's sick." He looked at me cautiously. "Do you want me to come?" I shook my head. "No, this one I need to do alone." The drive to Richmond took 3 hours. I didn't turn on the radio, I just listened to the tires hum against the asphalt, to the sound of my own breathing. The autumn trees blurred into streaks of gold and rust, like the world had decided to dress up for something solemn. When I reached the hospital, the air smelled of antiseptic and thyme. A nurse led me down a long corridor. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead, too bright, too clean. My mother was there, sitting in the corner of the room, clutching a paper cup of coffee gone cold. She looked smaller than I remembered, like grief had been pressing on her shoulders for years. When she saw me, her eyes widened. "Emily." "Hi, Mom." She stood but didn't know whether to hug me or apologize. In the end, she just reached out and touched my sleeve, a mother's compromise between love and fear. "He's asleep," she said. "He doesn't know you're here yet." I nodded. "That's okay." I turned toward the bed. My father looked pale, almost translucent under the harsh lights. The tubes, the monitors, the shallow rise and fall of his chest, they all made him look small, too human. For a long moment, I just stood there. This was the man who'd built fences and rules and hierarchies, the man who taught me to salute before I ever wore a uniform, the man who once told me tears were what happens when weak people run out of words. Now he was quiet, and I had no words either. That night, I stayed in a nearby motel. The air conditioner rattled like it was haunted, and I lay awake staring at the cracked ceiling. Around midnight, my mother called. "He's awake," she whispered. "He asked for you." I was there within 15 minutes. When I walked into the room, he looked up. His voice was thin but clear. "Didn't think you'd come." "I almost didn't," I said honestly. He gave a faint nod. "Figures." We stared at each other, two soldiers on opposite sides of a war neither had wanted to fight. Finally, he said, "You still in uniform?" "Always," I replied. He chuckled weakly. "Knew you'd make something of yourself. I just didn't know it'd be so far away from us." "You pushed me far, Dad." He looked away. "I was trying to make you strong." "You did," I said softly, "but you also made me lonely." That silenced him. The monitors beeped steadily, filling the gap between us. After a while, he said, "I never hated you, you know." "I know. I just didn't know how to love someone I couldn't control." Those words, raw, clumsy human, broke something open in me. I sat down beside the bed and took his hand. The same hand that once slapped the table when I said I'd join the Navy. The same hand that held a hammer to build that fence all those years ago. "You don't have to control me anymore," I whispered. "You just have to rest." He nodded, eyes glassy with unshed tears. The next morning, I helped my mother fill out some hospital paperwork. She kept apologizing for things she didn't name. The police, the letters, the silence. "I should have stopped him," she said. "You couldn't," I said gently. "No one could. He had to stop himself." When she turned away to hide her tears, I slipped my father's old ring, the one he wore when teaching, off the table, and held it. It was scratched, dull, and heavy. A nurse walked in. "Commander Carter," she said softly, recognizing me from my badge. "He told us you were military. He's been telling stories about you to the staff." "Stories?" I asked. She smiled. "Said his daughter's tougher than half the Navy. Said she makes him proud." I didn't cry right then, but when I stepped into the hallway, I leaned against the wall, closed my eyes, and let the weight of that word settle. Proud. That evening, before I drove back to Norfolk, I went to see him one more time. He was half asleep, pale but peaceful. He opened one eye. "Leaving already?" "I'll come back," I said. "Don't bother if I don't make it," he murmured. "I've said my piece." I smiled faintly. "You'll make it. You're too stubborn to quit now." He smirked, a ghost of the old him. "You get that from me." "Maybe," I said, "but I learned grace from Mom." He nodded, closing his eyes. "That's good. You'll need both." The drive home was long and quiet. Halfway back, I pulled over near a small roadside chapel, one of those white-painted country churches that look like they're holding secrets. I walked in, sat in the last pew, and whispered, "Thank you for letting me show up before it was too late." I didn't know if I was talking to God, to fate, or to the part of myself that had stayed angry for too long? Maybe all three. When I walked out, the sun was rising. I drove the rest of the way home in its light. David was waiting on the porch with 2 cups of coffee. "How was it?" "Hard," I said, "but right," he nodded. That's usually how the right things feel. We sat together, watching the sky brighten. For the first time in years, the silence between me and my father didn't echo. It simply ended. Spring returned to Norfolk the following year, soft and golden. The dogwoods bloomed early, and the base was alive again with new recruits, all nerves, all energy, all faith that hard work could fix anything. I saw myself in their faces. I also saw how wrong I'd been once to think strength meant isolation. It had been 6 months since my father's passing. He'd made it through the winter long enough for one last conversation, a goodbye disguised as small talk. He'd passed quietly at home with my mother holding his hand. She called me just after sunrise. Her voice was calm, almost formal. "He's gone, Emily. He said he loved you." I'd been at the harbor then, watching a destroyer glide out to sea. I remembered the smell of diesel and salt, the gulls cutting through the gray morning. When the call ended, I just stood there and whispered, "Fair winds, Dad." I didn't cry, not then. The funeral was small, as he wanted. I wore my navy dress whites at my mother's request. Some relatives didn't meet my eyes. Others did, with something like shame or gratitude. I didn't need either. I just stood at attention when the chaplain spoke and listened as they played taps. After the ceremony, I helped my mother into her car. She looked fragile, like the past year had aged her a decade. "Thank you for coming," she said. "I had to," I replied. "He taught me to show up even when it hurts." She nodded. "He was proud of you, you know. He just didn't know how to say it." "I know," I said. "I said it for both of us." We hugged, really hugged, for the first time in years. A month later, a small package arrived at my door. Inside was an envelope labeled, "To Emily, from Dad." The handwriting was weak but unmistakable, each letter pressed too hard, as if he were carving the words into the paper. "Emily, if you're reading this, I probably ran out of time. I don't know how to apologize properly. I always thought apologies made a man look small, but maybe small is where forgiveness starts. You were right to stand your ground. You were right to walk away. I tried to raise you strong. You ended up stronger than I could handle. I called the cops because I couldn't call myself out. Tell your husband I respect him. He stood by you the way I should have. You'll do better than I did. That's what every parent should want. Dad." The letter smelled faintly of motor oil from his workshop, I guessed. I read it 3 times, then folded it back and set it in my desk drawer, next to my medals. Not above them, not beneath them, beside them, equal. That summer, life began again in small, ordinary ways. My mother started calling every Sunday evening just to talk. She asked about David's work, about the new recruits, about my garden. Her laughter softened over the phone, lighter, freer. One evening she said, "I think he'd be happy seeing us like this." "I think so too," I said. David and I started hosting barbecues for our neighbors. Sometimes when the grill smoked and kids ran through the yard with sparklers, I'd catch myself looking up, half expecting to see my father leaning against the fence, a beer in hand, pretending not to smile. The ache didn't go away, but it changed. It became quieter, gentler, less a wound, more a weathered scar that told me I'd survived something important. One Saturday, I was invited to speak at a local high school's graduation. The principal introduced me as Commander Emily Carter, Navy SEAL and hometown daughter. The applause startled me. When I stepped up to the podium, the gym smelled of flowers and floor wax. I looked out at rows of faces, bright, hopeful, terrified of what comes next, and I thought of my father watching me once from a folding chair in that same gym. I took a breath. "When I was your age," I began, "I thought respect came from titles, medals, achievements. I was wrong. It comes from how you treat people. especially when they've stopped treating you well. Some of you will leave home and find that the people who should have loved you most didn't know how. Don't carry that anger forever. It gets heavy. Learn to set it down, even if they never ask you to, because forgiveness isn't letting them win, it's letting yourself rest. The room was quiet. A few parents nodded. A girl in the front row wiped her eyes. I smiled and said, "And call your mothers. They worry more than you think." The laughter that followed felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. That night, I stood on the porch again, coffee in hand, watching the streetlights flicker on. David joined me, wrapping an arm around my shoulder. "You spoke well today," he said. "Thanks," I said. "I just told them what I wish someone had told me sooner." He nodded toward the sky. "Your dad would have liked that speech." "Maybe," I said. "Or maybe he would have told me to shorten it." We both laughed. Then I whispered, almost to myself, "I think he finally heard me wherever he is." David squeezed my shoulder. "You think he's proud now?" I looked up at the quiet stars. "Yeah," I said, "and so am I." A week later, I found myself back at the church where I'd once married, with no family in the pews. This time it was filled with friends, colleagues, neighbors. One of recruits was getting married, and she'd asked me to give her away since her father couldn't attend. As the music started, I walked her down the aisle. She whispered, "I'm nervous." I smiled. "Then you're doing it right." When we reached the altar, she squeezed my hand. "Thank you for showing up." Her words hit me harder than I expected. Thank you for showing up. That's all I'd ever wanted from my father, from anyone. And now I understood. Sometimes the way you heal is by being the person you once needed. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I stood alone outside the church. The sky burned gold and pink, the same colors that had framed my own wedding day years ago. I whispered into the fading light, "I forgive you, Dad, and I forgive myself too." Then I turned and walked toward the car where David waited, the future open like a calm sea. If someone once made you feel invisible at your own table, I hope you still save them a seat, not for their sake, but for yours, because sometimes the greatest act of revenge isn't silence or distance or strength, it's peace. And peace, my friends, takes courage too.